My name is Elena Brooks. I was 27 when I realized that sometimes a family's greatest fear isn't losing the truth, it's losing the approval of people who barely know them. The engagement lunch had already begun when I noticed my younger sister, Lila, sitting unnaturally still at the far end of the table. At 19, she usually laughed with her hands, tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear every few seconds, and filled awkward silences before anyone else could. That afternoon, she barely touched the tea in front of her. Every smile looked rehearsed, every nod felt borrowed. Around us, relatives admired the decorations, complimented the food, and spoke as though the future had already been signed into existence. Only 3 days earlier, one careless rumor had spread through our neighborhood. No one could even agree where it started, yet suddenly my parents spoke as if our family's entire worth depended on proving something to strangers. They insisted an engagement would silence the whispers. Lila whispered once that she wasn't ready. My mother answered that happiness could wait, but reputation couldn't. My father avoided her eyes entirely. I kept telling myself there had to be a better moment to speak. Then I looked across the table and realized my sister wasn't simply nervous, she was terrified, and no one seemed willing to notice except me. The silence around the table became louder than the conversations themselves. I watched my sister fold and unfold the same paper napkin until the edges began to fray beneath her trembling fingers. Every few minutes someone congratulated her, yet no one asked the only question that mattered: is this what you want? I wondered if everyone had convinced themselves that avoiding discomfort was kinder than facing the truth. It wasn't kindness, it was fear wearing polite clothes. The groom seemed courteous enough, offering careful smiles and thanking relatives for their blessings. His mother, however, guided every conversation with quiet confidence, discussing wedding dates, guest lists, and future grandchildren as though Lila's silence meant agreement. My parents nodded along, relieved that everything appeared normal. I caught my sister looking toward the window, where the afternoon sunlight spilled across the garden. For a fleeting second, her expression wasn't hopeful, it was searching, as if she were looking for a way to leave without disappointing everyone she loved. That was the moment I understood that remaining silent would make me part of the same story she would one day struggle to forgive.
I wasn't planning to interrupt anyone. In truth, I spent several long minutes arguing with myself. Maybe I had misunderstood the situation. Maybe Lila would eventually find the courage to speak. Maybe our parents believed they were protecting her in the only way they knew how. Those thoughts circled endlessly until I looked at my sister again. She wasn't listening to the conversation anymore. She was staring at the untouched engagement ring resting inside its velvet box, as though it belonged to someone else's life. When the waiter cleared the lunch plates, a brief silence settled over the room. It felt like the first honest moment of the afternoon. Before anyone could fill it with another cheerful toast, I stood. My knees felt strangely unsteady, but my voice arrived calmer than I expected. I turned toward the groom's mother with genuine respect and said, "May I ask you one question before everyone celebrates?" She smiled politely and nodded without hesitation. None of us realized that one simple question was about to change the entire afternoon. I took a slow breath, careful to keep my voice gentle. If your own son told you today that he wasn't ready for this engagement, would you still expect him to go through with it because of what the neighbors might say? The room fell completely still. Even the quiet clink of dishes from the restaurant seemed to disappear. No accusation hung in my words. It was simply a question, one that asked everyone at the table to imagine the situation from the other side. The groom's mother didn't answer immediately. She looked at her son, then at Lila, whose eyes had filled with tears she had fought so hard to hide. The groom shifted uneasily in his chair, as if he too had been swept along by expectations he had never fully examined. My parents exchanged nervous glances, waiting for someone to rescue the conversation, but no one could. For the first time that afternoon, the discussion wasn't about family reputation, it was about choice. And once that question had been spoken aloud, pretending everything was normal was no longer possible. The groom's mother lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "No," she said quietly. "If my son wasn't willing, I would never ask him to promise a life he didn't freely choose." Her words weren't defensive, they were thoughtful, almost heavy, as though she had surprised herself by saying them aloud. The honesty in her voice seemed to loosen something that had been holding the entire room together. No one argued, no one rushed to change the subject. Then she turned gently toward Lila. "I realize we've all been discussing your future," she said, "but I don't believe anyone has truly asked how you feel." My sister's hands trembled as she looked around the table. She glanced at our parents, then at me, before finally whispering, "I'm not ready. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just didn't know how to say no." The words were barely above a whisper, yet they carried more weight than every speech that had been made that afternoon. In that quiet confession, the engagement stopped being a celebration and became what it should have been all along, a decision that belonged to the two people expected to live it. For several long moments, no one reached for a reply. My father rested both hands on the table, staring at the untouched teacup in front of him. My mother blinked back tears she had been trying to hide behind polite smiles all afternoon. It was as though they were seeing the difference between protecting their daughter and protecting an image of the family for the first time. The room no longer felt divided into sides. It felt filled with people quietly confronting themselves. The groom finally spoke, his voice calm and sincere. "If this isn't your choice, then I don't want you to feel obligated because of me." He closed the velvet ring box and slid it back toward himself, without anger or embarrassment. His mother gave a small nod of understanding, and the tension that had gripped the room began to soften. The engagement ended not with accusations or raised voices, but with an unexpected sense of relief. In the silence that followed, I realized that the truth hadn't broken our family. It had simply exposed the fear we had all been pretending not to see. The weeks that followed were quieter than any of us expected. Some relatives stopped calling for a while. Others whispered that the family had embarrassed itself by canceling an engagement so suddenly. Strangely, those opinions no longer carried the weight they once had. Our home, once filled with anxious conversations about appearances, became a place where silence slowly transformed into honest discussion. It wasn't comfortable, healing rarely is, but it was real. One evening, while helping my mother sort through an old wooden cabinet, I found a faded photo album. Between its pages rested a handwritten letter from my grandmother, written years before I was born. One sentence caught my attention immediately. "A family's honor is measured by how safely its children can speak the truth." I read it aloud. My mother covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. My father quietly asked to read the letter himself. That forgotten piece of paper became the conversation we should have had long before the engagement was ever arranged, and it changed something none of us could put into words. Months later, Lila enrolled in the university program she had quietly dreamed about for years. The engagement was never mentioned with bitterness again, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had taught us something we could no longer ignore. My parents didn't change overnight. Trust rarely returns that easily. Instead, it grew through small moments, asking instead of assuming, listening instead of deciding, and accepting that love cannot exist without the freedom to choose. Sometimes I think back to that afternoon and the single question that changed everything. It wasn't clever, dramatic, or meant to embarrass anyone. It simply made room for the truth to enter a conversation that had been crowded by fear.
Looking back, I don't remember the decorations, the speeches, or even the untouched ring. I remember my sister's first genuine smile as we walked into the evening light together. In that quiet moment, I understood that a family's reputation is never protected by silence. It's protected when the people within it know their voices will be heard.
In the end, what stayed with me wasn't the collapse of the engagement. It was the way silence finally lost its power in our home. We had spent so long trying to protect an image that we almost forgot the people inside it. And when the truth finally spoke, it didn't destroy us. It rearranged us into something more honest, more fragile, and strangely more human. There are moments in life when one question can do what years of fear never could: open a door no one had the courage to touch. That afternoon taught me that dignity isn't loud, and love doesn't demand obedience. It listens, it waits, and when it matters most, it gives a person the right to say no without punishment. If this story stayed with you, take a second to reflect. How often do we mistake silence for peace and pressure for protection? Comment below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where one voice changed everything? And if you want more deeply emotional cinematic stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The next story might just change the way you see your own family forever.